Good morning and welcome to Happy Hour with me. It's Eileen Cook. It is July 31st. I have absolutely no idea how it is almost August, but there it is. It is. So I had a particular question that came up about writing sequels or writing a series. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to dive into for a little bit. So I'm curious, why do you guys think readers and or publishers like series? Any guesses? Lisa.
Well, I find that I like series, so I engage with the characters and the world, especially in fantasy, because there's so much depth that goes into building a world that sometimes I'm sad when the book is over. So I like to have other books in the series so that I can still engage with those characters. Yeah.
And I do think that is probably the number one reason, which is that desire for people to stay within a world that has been created or within characters. And you will see series that, again, go both ways. So sometimes it's an ongoing world. So it's different people within that world. So, for example, a lot of what Crystal is writing is that idea of there are stories that take place within her River's End town, but they're different characters. Although you have this wonderful thing that happens where they sort of pop up in other stories, which I think readers love because it's that sense of, oh, I know that person. So I think that appeals to them. Anyone else have a reason that we think that readers or publishers like series?
It's a
Financially
known
better.
quantity.
Yeah, when you only have so much to read or so much time to spend with things, there are times where we want to kind of, again, stay within that world. I do think as a writer, it allows you to explore a much longer story arc. I don't know if anyone's loving Netflix or whatever, but they have these kind of what I think of as longer term series. So something that might be like Big Little Lies, where there's 9 or 10 episodes. And again, it might be multiple seasons of that, but there's sometimes just the thing that might have 5 or 6 episodes. And that's the end of it. But it's longer than a movie. So they want to sort of explore that world over a longer time period. And you can do a much bigger story because you typically have something that's taking place over all of those. The reason publishers like them, or why you'll see publishers engage with them, is that it is kind of what Alyssa was talking about with that known quantity. That is, if people start a series, they often will complete a series. So you have built-in readers coming to it. If they loved book 1, they're much more likely to obviously pick up book 2 and 3 and so forth. And God bless you, may you have something like Harry Potter, where they are waiting outline at midnight to buy your next book. May that happen to you. All right. So what happens, or what are the downsides to a series? Anyone want to guess why people may not like a series, other than you may not like the characters, so you don't want to spend longer with them? Lisa.
Book 2. And I only joke about that because sometimes people they have a great book 1 and then book 2 just sinks. It's like, wasn't well conceived of. That can be, as a reader, that can often be disappointing. I also find that as a writer, it's harder to, sometimes if you've got a longer story to tell, it's harder to get the whole story, like to get that arc built realistically and have that, and yet still have a self-contained, each story has to be self-contained in a book. Cliffhangers, mixed feelings about cliffhangers, having been on both sides of that. And how to do cliffhangers, that can be another part, like certainly you got to keep the door open for another story, but you at the same time have to conclude the story. So it can be harder to tie up all those loose ends.
I have to laugh because my very first note is beware of the dreaded middle book. So great minds thinking alike there. Alyssa, did you have something you wanted to add in?
I think that I've heard agents say that that when they hear first in a series, that the first assumption that they make is you didn't finish your first book, you've just cut it into 2. I don't know, has anyone else heard this?
I think there is the fear that you don't have, basically to some degree what Lisa's talking about is that you weren't able to either tie this all into one book, or you have a book that is basically a really big book that makes no sense broken into different parts. So unlike Netflix, where we might sign on and say, I'm going to watch Broadchurch and it's 10 episodes, and that's what I'm going to watch out of that series. Obviously, with books, people don't necessarily pick up books 2 or 3 or 4. So they're wanting to have a story that is still complete in and of itself and still satisfying, and yet still has enough material to sort of branch into other books. Typically what we saw for a long time is if people talked about a series, they meant 3 books. And the really big problem was the middle book was, book 1 was really exciting because it was the start of the story. It had all kinds of things. And book 3 was great because it had this great conflict resolution and you saw all these things tied together. And book 2 had the dreaded, they're just out there wandering around. I don't know if anyone remembers, there was a book, I'm trying to remember what the first book in the series, I think it was Matched, where these characters were basically like, the story started off great, but the middle book, all they honestly did, and this is maybe me being a little judgmental, was wander around, almost talking and waiting for book 3 to start, which for me made me not even want to read book 3, but apparently it was a great way to sort of end it. Some readers have a problem with series because it can take a long time between books, particularly if there is that sort of cliffhanger ending where you want to know what's going to happen. If you can't pick up the next book in the series right away, people get frustrated. I don't know if anyone has ever heard or people sort of talking about they'll wait until all the books are out in a series before they'll start reading it. Because they don't want that experience, right? They want to finish book 2 and then go immediately to book 3 and then on to the next one. And they get really frustrated if they can't do that. Well, of course, the downside of that is publishers may not publish books 2, 3, and 4 if book 1 doesn't sell well enough. So that can be a frustration. And typically what you will see, Harry Potter being one of the few exceptions, is that sales drop off over the course of a series. That is, that people who started with it don't necessarily see it all the way through. So for a publisher looking at a series, they obviously are wanting the biggest bang in one because they're counting that there will be some likely downturn in book sales. So that is something to consider. Lisa.
Oh, I was just remembering something I heard Kelly Armstrong say when we had a coffee clutch, and I think some of you were in the room too. But she talked about how young adult readers, like teens, they don't follow authors so much as adults do. Adults will follow an author saying, "Oh, I really like this author's book. I'm going to read their next book." But teens were less inclined to do that. So another aspect I imagine would be the series would at least get the teens to buy another book from that author because they get caught in that world. So that's probably why it was kind of popular amongst young adult books too.
I think it particularly for YA. And yeah, I think how long we've waited for Game of Thrones series to finish. How about Handmaid's Tale? First one came out in the 70s, next one coming out next year. Although I don't think, to be honest, that she ever intended there to be a sequel to that book. I think that certainly is a result of what has happened. And it was interesting when I was kind of looking at today's thing was a few authors talked about not planning to have done a series or a sequel, but readers so demanding or wanting another book that they ended up deciding to go back to that world. As I sort of mentioned, I think there's 2 basic kinds of book series or sequels, so you should probably know which one you're writing. So the first is where you have some kind of overarching story arc that is starting in book 1 and isn't completing until the end. And the second being a series of stories that are just happening within the same world. So you'll see a lot of mystery series that are that way, where there's not an overarching arc. The character may be evolving and changing. As I mentioned, Crystal's stories are a good example of that. They're all taking place within the world of River's End, but they are self-contained, and all those things make a difference. The only other thing I've seen is if you sometimes see a story, the first one was, I think, Something Borrowed, and the sequel was Something Blue. And it was Something Borrowed is the story of a character who's about to get married, and she finds out that the woman who was her maid of honor is carrying on an affair with her fiance before the wedding. Dun, dun, dun. And what is interesting is if you read the sequel, Something Blue, it's the exact same story. It's just told from the best friend's perspective. So it's kind of an interesting example. Obviously, there are different things happening, but overall, it is the exact same story plot. But I certainly found it interesting as a reader because I had read the first book, and of course, I can't remember the character's name, but I'm going to call her Darcy. And it was like, oh, I hate Darcy. What a horrible person she is. How dare she do this, right? And then when I read the second book, it was like, well, I kind of get where Darcy's coming from. And things were way more complicated in that friendship than I gave credit for in the first book. So I thought it was a very interesting, but I certainly don't see that very often. In fact, I think that was the only one that I could kind of come across, but I'm sure there are others.
Well, the Wicked series, like Wonderful, and Wicked was the witch, and then Wonderful was the
Glinda.
What was? Oh yeah, then there was the wizard story, and everybody, yeah, same story, yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting way to sort of explore something in a series, to something to consider. So I went through and I read a whole bunch of articles on kind of writing series, and I tried to distill down the points to a few things that came across in multiple articles. So I'm not taking credit for this as much as I am giving you the Reader's Digest condensed version of a whole bunch of advice. So the one thing that I saw that I kind of liked, which was the first rule of writing a book series is that you have to have enough content to justify more than one book. So I really liked that quote. It made me laugh. But I think it actually gets into the comment you were talking about, Alyssa, which is there are sometimes people who don't have enough content and they've stretched it out. And so I think that may be what agents are expressing some concern about, is how is that story going to fill? And, you know, some people talked about rather than trim down a book, so you have someone, and again, as someone who's done editing, someone who says, oh, here's my book. It's a 140,000 word fantasy novel. And I say, oh, well, it's too long. So they're like, oh, well, then I'll make it 2 books. Whereas really maybe it needed to be a 100,000 word book, and they just actually weren't willing to cut the fat. And so they ended up with 2 books, but it really wasn't 2 books. The other thing which came up in different ways, but I think is useful, which is planning is everything. So that came up in different ways that people talked about this, but that if you are intending and planning to write a series, you're going to need to do a bit more structure and planning to make sure that you're not creating plot holes and problems as you go along with the book. So you're going to need to have to figure out, for lack of a better term, how you're going to keep track of all of this information. So whether that's a series Bible, whether that's timelines, calendars, all of the above. I know a few people, I think even in here, keep Excel spreadsheets of character details. But those are the kinds of things that if you have something very different in book 2 or 3, or you've screwed up the timeline, people are going to have problems with that. So you're going to have to figure out how you want to track that. And I know people have used different things in Scrivener. You know, I saw certain things online where people had huge calendar sheets. So they had a calendar for each book. So they could easily go back and actually look at a calendar sheet and be like, okay, that happened on August 1st. And then I had said there was 2 weeks. So that means the next event happened on August 15th. And so forth, so that they could easily reference back and keep track of what was going on. If it's been a while, I think part of that is make sure that you study and almost reread your books. I don't know if anyone's had this experience, but like in traditional publishing, it's often a year between when books are coming out. So when I'm getting ready for a book launch, I always reread my book to remember, and it's kind of scary how often I've forgotten characters' names or various parts of it. So if you're doing a series, if it's been a while at all, just take the time to reread your book. There was a lot of articles that I read on that were around kind of the focus of indie publishing, which obviously is not going to be as much reference if you are planning to go traditional. But if you are thinking about going indie, keep in mind around timing. So you're going to want to have the books come out within a reasonable period of each other. And there was a lot of debate about what that was. So there were people that were talking about drop the first book in the series as a freebie and then drop books 2 and 3 at the same time. Other people suggesting, a month between books. Other people suggesting 3 months between books. But certainly what was clear with all of the indie things, and I know this has been discussed in Crystal's office hours as well, is you're not going to want to have huge gaps of time between the series books. This may mean that you need to be writing a bunch of them before you are putting the first one out. The huge benefit of that is if you have a problem with your book and you haven't yet released it, you could go back. Or if you're writing book 2 or 3 and you have a realization, you could go back and seed that into book 1. So that is the benefit of not releasing all at one time. So it gives you a chance to kind of figure out what those things are going to be. If you are traditionally publishing, this is not going to be an option because your release schedule is not up to you. But I would encourage you, if you are querying book 1, to be writing book 2. And that gives you the option of, 1, being able to tell your publisher that you're closer to it. And also because book 1 tends to take a long time to write, and the publisher will probably want book 2, ideally, to come out within a year, which means you need to get going on book 2. So keep that in mind. Yes, do not do a bad thing where you pre-lease and then have promised a whole bunch of books in a series and you're madly having to scramble to write those. I think you're just putting way too much pressure on yourself. So having those written ahead of time is the way to go. One of the things I thought was interesting is that a few people talked about the idea of, and I'm going to be curious for the people here what your experience is if you have any favorite series, but they talked about you're trying to ride the perfect balance between giving people what they expect and then twisting it in a new way. That if you're regurgitating the same story kind of over and over again, that's not as interesting. So they're kind of saying that that's what they want, right? Like they're like, oh, I want to go back. But if it's the same story, so one of the examples that they used is if you have Jurassic Park and Jurassic Park 1 is, holy cow, there's an island with dinosaurs on it. And then Jurassic Park 2 is, holy cow, there's another island with dinosaurs on it. That's not that interesting of a series, that you really are just telling the story in a very slightly different way, but it's the exact same setup and same conflicts. And again, even though, readers are saying, oh, I want to go back there, I want to do that, they're wanting somehow something to be different. So really challenging yourself about what are you going to do to avoid kind of spitting the same story again, where it's the same character doing the same thing in maybe a slightly different setting. Yes, Hollywood is the master of regurgitating stories. There was some interesting ideas around that, around kind of how to create something new. So whether or not you can raise the pressure, so you can somehow amp it up in some different ways, whether or not you change the stakes. So what was at stake in book 1 is no longer at stake because you've resolved that, but there's something new that is at stake. Sometimes you're playing with expectations. So for example, and again, I'm using some film examples in Alien. In the initial one, the alien is kind of the bad guy. He's the villain. And then they sort of switch that up. Or if you think of the Terminator movies, she's a, kind of naive woman in Terminator. I was going to say book 1 of Terminator, the movie Terminator. And then, when you look at Terminator 2, she's this sort of battle weary person, and she actually combines with the Terminator. They're then working together, which would be unexpected. So that is possibly why that's working. One of the advice that I got that I liked quite a bit was, include at least one great new character. So bringing somebody else onto the scene who can sort of take the book in a new way. And kind of similar to that is to be not afraid to possibly let a beloved character go. Whether that's that you kill them off, you know, I'm a fan of that in my books, but you don't have to kill them off. But if for some reason they're not front and center, I think there's this desire that I have to bring all of these people back, and I don't think that you need to do that. So being willing to let someone go can be good. Other people's thoughts about how, like, is there sequels that really worked for you? And now that you think about it, what was it that worked in those later books? Ponder on that if you're not sure.
I think changing the character arc is kind of the key thing to making different books work. Like, so the first book, often it's the character is naive, like, especially if it's a secondary world, it's like they're in a new world and they don't know how things work. And then often in the second book, they know the world a bit better, but the problems are getting bigger. Or similarly, if it's like, say, there's a romance arc, sometimes the first book is them getting together, and then they're together by the end of the first book, and then the second book, they have to figure out how to make it work. Or they're separated, or it's, you know, something playing with that dynamic. So I think there's a lot of really good series that do it well. But yeah, you definitely have to think, okay, what was the conflict in book one? How do I make it different for book two?
How do you change it up? And one person had, which I thought is like, here's the biggest challenge I can think of. The quote that they had is, identify what made the first book special, then offer more. I was like, oh, that's simple. Just do that. They didn't actually have any advice on how to do that. So I'm also being useless by offering the same thing. But I think it is an interesting thing to think about. What is it that appealed to you about that book? Or what is it that readers love? And how can you amp that up? One moment, I'm going to yell at a dog. Dog has been silenced. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at, Marianne had a question in the chat window. So she's planning a 7+ book series. No reason to start small, Marianne. Nicely done. 7+ book series of standalone romances with a group of friends. And I feel I need to plan the entire series so the same people are in all the books. The challenge is for me to give them all a meaningful role, even when it's not their story, and how to plan the series so that each story is foreshadowed with layers for character development. Yeah, that's not going to be easy, but I think it's really an excellent idea. And it's going to be, I would probably be wanting to write a couple of them ahead of time, or be really comfortable with 5, she says, because that allows you to kind of jump back and forth between the books as you're writing, which I think will make that way easier, and will make that much better. But I think people are going to fall in love with those friends, and then they're going to want to see what happens to them. And even though the first person's romance may be over,
that's my devious plan.
I want to see what happens to them. And I think it is that idea of, you know, oftentimes I'll have people say to my books like, oh, I wish you would write a sequel to With Malice, so we know what happens after the book. But the problem is they think that they want that, but they really don't, because they're like, the characters already reached their ending. It might be interesting to write a book that butted up against that, where there was a secondary plot line where you saw what happened to the characters in With Malice. And that's where I think Marianne will have that advantage, is she'll be able to not have a story that is about those characters because their story was told in book 1, but because I love them and I care about them, I'll be happy to see them in book 2 and find out, oh, they had a baby, or whatever it is that has happened to them that will sort of carry that on. One thing I wanted to talk about is people talk about, well, how do you get the events of a previous book into the next book without having too much repetition? The best advice I saw in different things, and a lot of people talked about one of the things that I don't particularly like, which is chapter 1, where there's some sort of odd retelling of exactly what happened in book 1, which is not a particularly great opening. Is they were like, just remember that whatever happened in book 1 is backstory from book 2. So in the same way that when you're writing book 1, you know there's a whole backstory before your book ever started, how you slip it in, that's the same advice you need to follow when telling book 2, is it's the backstory for the previous story. So I think that was actually, I think, an interesting way to have that sort of connection to get it in. Having said that, is anyone read the A is for Alibi, B is for Burglar, Sue Grafton series? It's a mystery series. I didn't finish all the way through before she stopped writing, but one of the things that kind of drove me a little bit crazy is the first chapter of those books were almost always the same, because they were meant that you could read them in any order. And so she would always do almost this recap that was exactly the same description of the apartment and the exact same description of this main character. And for me, I would almost completely switch around and read chapter 2 first, just because I didn't care about that. Having said that, you don't want to just drop people in, so they need to be able to figure that out. Yes, the Babysitter's Club books were exactly like that. And I think there were a lot of, when you had those kind of what I would consider episodic stories, so there really wasn't a big story arc. And they were really meant that you just pick them up in any which way or order. There was a lot of repetition in those first chapters. But I think today's readers are not going to be so much fond of that. So you're going to have to figure out how to do that. I think if you are doing something like Marianne's goal of doing, a big overarching story, or if you have, kind of a 3-book series that that has a big plot point, is to think about knowing your series ending as you start. Even if you're not someone who wants to plot it out all the way, having taken the time to sort of think through how that's going to work is probably going to go a long way to helping you, because I think about, and I don't know how many people have this experience, I almost 100% of the time rewrite my first chapter after I've written the end of the book. And that is because once I get to the end, I know things that I didn't know when I started the book, and I'm often going back and kind of setting up things. And again, you'll often see books that have sort of starts and openings that sort of show a full circle. So we start in the Shire, we go on this magic journey, and we end in the Shire. We start in the North Pole, and then we're Buddy the Elf, and we go through the whirly twirly forest. We go to New York, and then we come back to the North Pole. Or there's kind of bookends where you see the character very different at the end versus the beginning. And since I haven't gotten to the end yet, I don't always know the beginning. So I think if you're writing a series, having some idea about where you want things to end up may help you as you're writing those earlier versions. I did put it on Glip because I came across a quote that I loved, so much that I kept it for myself. But it is, the plot outline is like a game plan in football. It can look good on the chart, but once the ball flies, it does not suffice. The plan is not sacred. It shifts depending on the position of the players on the field and the flight of the ball in the wind. Now, part of that may be, I love football. We're coming up to football season, so I'm ready to start imagining that. But I also think it's just that great idea of, as much as I want to be a full and complete plotter, and I try so hard to plot, is once you get everything going, it does change. So being flexible with that and understanding that it is going to have some shift is probably likely going to help you out a lot as you're thinking that you have a game plan, but that is not the be-all, end-all of things. So let me go through and make sure I'm hitting all their advice. Keep growing the characters. So that is that the characters do need to continue to shift and change. And again, sometimes people struggle with this, but you can look at how a problem may change. So for example, if I was writing the story of my life as a fiction story, there would be certain things within me that potentially have changed. So if I was writing a YA novel, it might be about my friendship with Laura and the, you know, challenges that I had. And there are certain fundamental personality traits that are going to probably keep coming up. I keep thinking that I've figured it all out, but I usually have not. So those same weaknesses may come up, but they play out in a different way because now I'm a different situation, a slightly different person. Marianne, you had a comment on that, I think?
I'm typing, but I'll say it because it's faster. One of the interesting things, if you have the kind of series where you've got one main protagonist that has a series of adventures, whether that's one long arc or a series of mysteries that are solved or whatever, is that as that character evolves, you can take experiences that they've had, whether it's being wounded in some way or learning a lesson of some kind, and hang on to that and bring it back later so that readers of the series can see how that character is responding differently to this new challenge or conflict because of that prior experience or that wound or something that happened, 3 books ago or whatever. So that's the kind of thing that I think you probably want a fair bit of, so that the character is obviously growing and learning from their experiences.
So as things are happening to them, or take away a win. So if you have a character that has, learned to love again and is doing, really well with this stuff, and then potentially you torture them again in some new fresh way in book 3 or 4, and they lose the ground that they've covered. In fact, maybe they go further back because they had started to believe and trust, and now this thing has happened and it's taken them even further back. And so we get the triumphant moment of hopefully when they recover from that again.
That depends a lot on genre and brand, though. So I was just thinking, like, say in my 7-book series, the first couple that has their happily ever after at book 1, by book 6, you kill one of them.
Oh, don't do that.
No, I'm just saying you could, but it would depend on what kind of a series, and you would really make people mad. But if you were writing more angsty, literary or women's fiction or mystery or something, you could easily do that. You could easily kill off a loved one and create all sorts of, challenges and growth for the character. But
paying attention to genre. Not in romance. But I might do something like, if I had a character who had a really hard time trusting people and then finally allowed herself to fall in love in book 1, in book 3, she may have a parent that dies, and that, depresses her and, drives her apart from her husband. They may, and it's like she's fallen back into old habits and she doesn't feel comfortable sharing that. And then they have to come back together again, or there's an unplanned pregnancy. But keeping in mind, not violating the trust, right? So for a romance, for example, one of the biggest things is that there's some idea of happily ever after. And if you're going to rip that away from them, they are going to, they're not going to be happy. I haven't read Idaho. So I don't know if I want to right now. I don't know if I'm ready for that emotionally. So thinking about those kinds of things, I think will sort of be helpful. So, I mean, again, I guess what I'm getting at with this idea, which I think is interesting, is characters grow or change. And sort of when we're writing a standalone novel, there's almost the expectation that they've now just got this thing, like, oh, they needed to learn to love and trust again, and now they have, and they have a happily ever after. But within a series, you can explore the fact that most of us, we have a little bit of give and take. If you have a character who loves and trusts, if something happens, they may revert back to old habits and then have to relearn that lesson again in a different way. So it may be something complete, like their love relationship may be great, but it's something that's happening within their workplace that's then impacting them in different ways. But again, we don't always have that full thing.
Can I just ask a question, He?
Of course.
Yeah. And because I tuned in late, so maybe you guys have already talked about this, but it's just that notion of series versus sequel, and then complexity of story. Because I know as new writers and being involved with new writers, we tend to want to put everything into one book, right? Like every idea we've got, it's like, hey, it's in here, it's in here. And then when we are lucky enough to have a mentor like Eileen, we are pulling out stuff and creating perhaps separate stories. Why I'm even, concerned about it is now that my niece has got me addicted to Netflix, I'm watching these different shows that are so amazing. But like each episode is like this friggin' novel, and there's so much in it. So I'm thinking like we've been watching Good Girls, and it's just like, oh my God. So then I'm thinking, God, my little Sam story is like really dull. So it's like,
it helps if you have 15 writers in a room, Christy, then
Right?
you don't run out of ideas so fast.
Right? I know. So it's like, what do I keep in? Am I being too boring? Am I being too cautious with my storytelling? Yeah.
Oh, leave it to Christy to ask a hard question. I think it is a hard thing because you can look at a story that can be a full novel that is dealing with one issue, and it's seeing every possible angle of that issue from all different perspectives, and I never way feel any like, oh, this didn't go anywhere. And I can also see novels that have everything in the kitchen sink in it, but it also isn't necessarily tied together. So I think that's almost the idea of getting into, if you have to say, this is a story about, and being able to sort of summarize that can help. And then certainly remembering a Netflix series and or a series of books, you have the option of having conflicts that don't get resolved in books 1, 2, and 3, and you don't resolve it until book 4, but those conflicts are showing up in books 1 and 2 and 3. So the reader has seen them, and that's not necessarily a brand new story. Marianne.
So just relating to what Christy says about how much stuff you can cram into one book, and this isn't really necessarily related to series, but I just read The Overdue Life of Amy Byler. Anybody read that? By Kelly Harms. And it's romantic women's fiction, so it's kind of like more or less in a similar genre to what I write. But when I read a book like that, it was very accomplished. It's so intimidating. She's got the husband who left and cheated. She's got two kids, one tween and one teen, who each have their own issues. She's got 2 best friends who are kind of like the angel and the devil on her shoulders. She's got the new love interest, and she's got her own, identity and self-esteem issues. And so there's some kind of women's role models and relationship and psychology, and it's all there in that book. Like not one thing necessarily dominates or is neglected in any way. And I just find that so intimidating because I tend to focus on not just one issue, but one primary or maybe 2 primary relationships, but to juggle all of those relationships and how they all factor into the protagonist's growth, to me is amazing. And I don't know, maybe it's just something to do with, where we are in terms of our growth as writers, but I can't even conceive of a story that's got that many parts to it. Like my brain won't do it. You know what I mean?
Well, and here's Christy smiling and nodding, but Christy has a story with Sam, who's dealing with the death of his wife. He has 2 daughters and their ability to deal with their death, as well as one of them has a boyfriend and is moving on. Plus Sam has his friends who have all of their issues, including the Rose, who is a transgendered character who's coming back into it. So when Christy says she's not sure she has enough story, you can watch Marianne's face do the scrunchy face. She thinks you're crazy. I think you have plenty happening in that story. And the question is, How do you dig into those things and show them? And I think that's what Marianne is getting at.
Doing them justice, not
Yeah.
being superficial with some pieces of it, right?
And thinking of what is the arc for Sam with each of his daughters? What is the arc with Sam with his friends? What is the arc with Sam on his own personal emotional journey with his ex-wife? And he even has, as I recall, a romantic relationship in there, or there's at least a neighbor who likes him. So he's, dealing with that. So just looking to say almost each of those could be a story. You could write a book about Sam dealing with his daughter's grief, or Sam just dealing with his own. So your job is to do justice to each of those things and not feel that you don't necessarily have enough in there. And I think it was interesting, as Mary was talking, I was like, is it, where we are in our own growth as a writer? Is it how a story comes to us? I always think it's so interesting when you talk to people about kind of what flags us from different stories. And sometimes I try and tell things in a different way, but I tend to revert to a way that just works for me. So I think not to feel bad, but to sometimes push ourselves and to take a book like Marianne's talking about, or another book that you feel did that really well, and trying to figure out, how did the author do that? That would be a book I'd be really interesting. For me, I've told people this before, where I've done a thing where I take index cards and I, do an index card for each chapter of a book. So I would do chapter 1, it's Marianne getting over the fact that her husband's cheated on her. These are the main things that happen in that scene. And I would write down what characters are in that scene. And then chapter 2, here's who's in that chapter. And here's a bullet point list of the main things. And then sometimes I will, because I'm a dork, I will color code subplots. So if there's the subplot of what's happening with the friends, that's in light blue. And if it's the subplot about her daughters, that's in orange. And her romantic relationship is in pink. And, whatever that is, so that I can kind of see visually, because I'll lay it out on the table, how did the author build that story? Where did those things come in? And what can I learn from how they did that? And for me, it actually is, I hesitate to use the term autopsy because it sounds like I'm chopping up their story, but I guess in some ways I am. I'm trying to figure out, how did they do that? How did that author weave all those things together and not get lost in that kind of thing, where I can see these chapters did double duty with these 2 or 3 different subplots, and what can I potentially take with that? But I think there always is one overarching story question for each book. So keeping that in mind. So I scrolled through and I found 2 other pieces of advice that I didn't mention, so I'm going to mention them. So one was, if you are writing a sequel or a series, don't feel that you have to pick up exactly where the last story left off, that there may be a break in time. You may actually go back again for something like what Marianne's doing. It may be that book 2 starts with another couple that meets at the wedding that was some of the final scenes in book 1. So you may actually see scenes of the wedding again. So you may actually go back in time, or she may flash forward. So keeping in mind, you don't have to take over exactly where you left off. And that, I think, will help get away from that fear of having a book that is chopped up in pieces. So that would be something to take a look at. And then the last piece of advice, which I think is useful, is know when to call it quits. So not every story needs a sequel, a prequel, a different angle, or a spinoff. So maybe the story does need to stand alone. And I can think of, and there have been some books where I loved the first book and I kind of wish it had just ended there. But there had been, for whatever reason, whether it was marketing or publishing reasons, a series that had maybe gone on for too long. So, and you certainly see that with TV series. And in fact, there's the term, people have heard the term jumping the shark. I don't know if people know where that comes from. But they'll talk in TV circles like, oh, that series has jumped the shark. And this may be dating it, but how many people remember Happy Days when it was on TV? which went on forever. And there was the Fonz. Does anyone remember when the Fonz jumped his motorcycle over a tank with sharks? There was an episode where that is where the term comes from, jumping the shark, which is at that point, the Fonz, even like he was already older, Henry Winkler was older when he filmed the series, but at that point, I think he was like in his late 30s, 40s, still playing this. And like the kids had eventually bought the diner. If you remember, Ralph and the Potsy had bought the diner, and they're still like, the series had come to its end, but because it had been a moneymaker, the network was very, very reluctant to end it. And so they had to keep coming up with more and more bigger ways. So they had the Fonz jump the shark. So that is the idea, that you're now just making up ridiculous things to keep going. So please know when it has kind of come to an end. This is interesting. So Marianne has in the chat window, she's thought about writing a novella or a shorter piece to start off the series that would be at the 10-year reunion. So you're seeing different characters' points of view. And she wants to know, would that capture the interest of readers of the series? Or maybe it should be limited and just other cast members. I'd definitely be interested to have it, but I'd almost would be tempted to write it last. Like, I think of it as being something I'd want at the end of the series, just because I think that otherwise the risk is so much that you tip and give us something that's why I'm reading the series for. I don't know. I'm curious, other people, their thoughts on that? They're typing it in. They're all so quiet. Cynthia.
Unmute. Okay, did I unmute?
Yes.
Okay, I like that idea, Marianne, but I'm wondering if I could see myself reading those books, how much of it then would, be constantly going back in time and flipping around back and forth. If you needed to introduce what happened before the reunion as part of the story going forward.
Yeah, no, my idea anyway is that the reunion would just be a way of introducing a cast of characters that would populate the whole series, and that there would be one main story, like a pre-story story in the novella, but that in the process of telling that story, you meet and raise interesting questions about at least a half a dozen of the other key characters, so that they don't get their story, but you kind of know who they are, what their issues, maybe a little something about who they were 10 years ago, but it doesn't tell you what their story is going to be. It just gives you a sense of who they are and maybe raises questions, I don't know, about the past or where they're going to end up. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's all I'm thinking about right now.
Alyssa, you had a thought?
And no one's going to die. That was just me being facetious.
I don't know what other people's opinions are, but I really don't like novella lengths. I don't read them. Even a series that I love, and I've read every book in the series, I don't read the novellas because I feel like it's not enough story for me. I don't get deep enough into it to enjoy. So I just personally don't read novellas. I don't know if anyone else.
I don't like them either. But this would be meant as a teaser, right? It's like, and you'd have to write it well enough that each of the characters was intriguing, that you'd want to know, like, then what, right? Because it's not a standalone. I can't stand standalone novellas because I think that's it. Like it's all over. It's not that it's all over too fast. It's that there's not enough development to justify it somehow.
Well, and many people love novellas, you too.
I know.
But they're a different
I like big books.
Yes.
I can't help it.
I like big books and I cannot lie. All right, so
sorry.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I think
on this novella question. So you're saying that it's at the 10-year reunion. Is that the 10 years after the other stories have taken place? Or
No, before
10-year high school reunion or 10-year reunion or something? And this is
it's the 10-year high school graduation reunion.
Yeah, so it's at the beginning, and then this is where we would kind of meet the characters.
Yeah.
And then something really drastic might happen that would intrigue people.
Yeah.
I've read novellas, but I usually read them because they're free. they're the good length to give away for free.
That's the plan.
And if you can, if you can do a concise story there, but if the purpose is just to introduce people, it might not be, so there have to be a very strong driving force. I also agree with Alyssa. Like, I know I've read the what is it? Throne of Glass or whatever. Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, I've read a whole bunch of those, and then after a while, I was like, oh my God, I can't read anymore. And I never read any of the Assassin's Blade or any of the shorts because I was just like, no, you've made me read like, 1,000 pages, thousands and thousands of pages, and I'm not going to go through that for one short little story. Anyways, so, but in the case that you write in romance, right, normally, or women's fiction, so it's got a little bit less, it's not like fantasy, so it's not so bad in a shorter genre, so it might work.
Well, and there would have to be one main hook that gave that story purpose. Otherwise, it would be really annoying, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you need to make it clear that the other books in the series, because even when I just read it in the chat window, I was thinking it's a reunion, so the other stories are happening before this. Mm-mm. So I was thinking in terms of, well, you're taking the suspension out, and like even Christy's point, like, well, if anyone died, then like, if they're all at the reunion and happy, then I know all their stories worked out. So this obviously is taking place, and it's probably just the word reunion.
It's the
prequel.
The trigger for the series.
Yeah. And it, I can see where it would work, because you could have a group of, for example, high school friends or college friends who haven't seen each other for a long time. And now they're, we should stay in touch, or that kind of thing. So you now have this group of people back together. But whatever it is, it's got to be a standalone story that is intriguing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Big chill, basically. You're a group of people that are coming together.
And then stuff happens, right? But not in one book, in a series of books. But I have one hooky thing to give the novella a kind of a twisty purpose. And that's why I'm not sure how many points of view to have, because a movie's different, right? Because you can have all these little different storylines happening.
And keep in mind that whatever the tone or feel that you want for the books should be set up then in that prequel. So don't make it, for example, a really romantic story if the books aren't romantic, because then I'm going to come back and want those to be like, if it's set up as a mystery that happens at the reunion, but the rest of the books aren't mystery, then that is going to be an issue. And I think Lisa raises a good point, like just depending on the novella and the size of it, you're going to have only a certain number of points of view that you can kind of squish into it. Other questions or thoughts on series? Other questions or thoughts on something you'd like discussed in office hours? Because we will be back here next week.
So a quick question on querying a series. I've heard conflicting things. I've heard, oh yes, you're right, it's the first book, it's a standalone book with series potential. And then I've read, oh no, people don't believe that anymore. I don't know, I've heard so many conflicting things. So I have not mentioned series at all in my query letter, although it is.
And I have heard.
Supposed to be the first book in this.
Yeah. I have heard multiple things as well. I mean, I think fundamentally it's going to come down to if they love those initial pages and they're bringing them in, then they're going to discuss it with you anyway. So you can either mention that it's a series or not. It's up to you. If it's an agent that reps a lot of series, I'd be more inclined to include it's a standalone book, but can be the first in the series. If it isn't, then I might be more than likely to just pitch it as a standalone book. And then when I'm talking to the agent, when they're in love with it, say, I certainly feel like it could be sequels, and I have ideas for books, 2 and 3 to continue on with that. And that is a way of sort of handling that, that kind of thing. So that's probably how I would handle it. I think there's still an interest in YA, as kind of, Lisa pointed out, still an interest in YA for series. So I think there's some potential there. And it's the problem of, when it's done badly, it impacts everyone. And so that's why you're probably hearing some of that flashback. But I would be very surprised if an agent is in love with an idea that they would be like, oh, it's part of a, forget it. I'm not even going to ask for pages. I just don't think that's the way they work. All right. Well, it is that time, ladies. I was going to say ladies and gentlemen, but they're, you know. So I want to thank everybody for coming. If you have any questions or issues, feel free to send them to me by email and all those kinds of things. And until then, take care, everybody. I'm going to stop recording.
Thanks, everyone.